For those of you who weren't downstairs just now, my name is Christian. I'm the director of the Centre for Social Justice, and we're delighted to welcome you to this evening's debate about, well, as it's entitled, Compassion in British Politics. You will stand for the poorest after May 2015. And the panel turning around there to check that they did get the briefing, which is a relief. And I want to thank the panel so much for being with us tonight, and I particularly want to thank Sarah, because Sarah was up, as she often is, of course, at 3:30 a.m. this morning, and into the Today programme studio, where you eyeballed the Prime Minister himself, gave him a very tough time on the Today programme. And so you are well and truly warmed up, I guess, for the most important thing you're doing today. But I'm just incredibly grateful to you for making the time, because you have such long days, and we really appreciate your being with us.
It's just a warm-up for tonight.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. It's so. I shouldn't say this, but it's so comforting to hear your voice. It's just everyone's thinking it, so I have to say. I wake up with you at 6 o'clock. When those pips go, it is so comforting. Anyway, unless we're on it and the story is bad, I'm gonna probably resign now and get off the stage. But what I would say, just quickly before I do that, is that this evening is about something actually very important, which is of course UK poverty. And amidst the noise of the campaign, whether that's about Europe, immigration, deficit, debt, NHS, the themes that will come to dominate the next 5 or 6 weeks, it's really crucial for us to spend some time thinking about that, and to gather top people from left and right to stake their claim really on this topic and this theme. So you'll have had a chance to pick up a CHJ manifesto, so you know what we think about who should stand for the poorest and how they do that. But we're really excited about this evening's event. So over to you, Sarah, and thank you very much to you all for coming. Please welcome the panel.
Christian thanks me, recognising that I might be a bit tired. I should immediately thank Lord Maurice Glasman, who stood in for John Cruddas. You may have been expecting to have that. John's got flu. Lord Glasman only flew in from Australia a day or so ago, so huge thanks to him. We're not going to be falling asleep because we're going to be gripped by the discussion. I'm going to assume a certain amount of knowledge in the room. We'll try to, we can catch up a little bit, and I'll try to sort of ensure that I don't skip over some things. And I'm always about to automatically skip over the idea that Lord Glasman, in case you don't know, founder of Blue Labour. Are you writing the Labour Party manifesto at the moment?
Not directly.
But you're involved with John Cruddas, and we're sort of we'll tap into that in a few moments' time. Tim Montgomerie, you'll know, among other things, founder of Conservative Home, and more recently a columnist everywhere, pretty much, and more recently the setting up of The Good Right. The form, we'll chat for just over half an hour, 40 minutes. I'll keep the conversation on stage, then I'll open up for questions. So if there's something you think, she missed that, I really want to know about this, just make a mental note, and we'll get to some microphones out and have a conversation in the room in a short while. I've got slight echo on my microphone. Is it at home? It's not bothering you? Lovely. Thank you. Solved. Perfect. Tim Montgomerie, I think the starting point has to be The Good Right in a way, because with this question, who will stand for the poorest after May the 2015, it struck me that when you set up The Good Right, and I saw it was described as a soft and furry Tory alternative, and I think was that sort of, did you set up in exasperation that the Conservative Party was still the nasty party rather than the compassionate Conservative that was talked about in 2010?
Not an exasperation, because I do think, we might get into the detail of some of this, that the coalition government has made an awful lot of progress on a number of fronts, and I think a lot of unemployment was predicted in this parliament, and my conception of fighting poverty would begin with the idea that a job and work in a household is hardly anything more important for fighting poverty. 2 million extra jobs in this country is a huge advance. But if you look at the opinion polling and you diagnose the Conservative problem, why do floating voters, let alone the people at the bottom of the income pile, feel that they can't support the Conservatives, the number one reason by a long way is that the Conservative Party won't stand with people in tough times, that it's the party of the rich. That problem was big 5 years ago, and it's got worse. So, the good right has sort of two aims. One is to say actually the Conservatives don't have a bad story to tell about poverty, and wants to help the Conservative Party to tell that story. But to also say, absolutely, to answer your question, the Conservative Party has some way to go. I think housing policy in particular, the Conservative Party is nowhere near close enough to addressing the scale of a massive social problem in this country. But on other issues, well on its way to doing what needs to be done.
Okay, and in outline, the good right, you're proposing raising the minimum wage. What are the other things? Increasing council tax. It's it's not a mansion house tax, but it's basically making the wealthy pay and making those at the bottom pay less.
There's lots of... Our basic belief is that if you want to defeat poverty, you need strong families, you need job creation, and you need a good education. Whereas I think the left would start with the view that you need a bigger welfare state. I support a safety net, and I think Conservatives are sometimes reticent about the importance of providing a safety net for everyone. But it's those three things that are most important. They were where the Centre for Social Justice started. Those pathways out of poverty, family, education, work, as well as freedom from addiction and freedom from debt. But if you're going to achieve those sort of policies, providing people with a home, you can't really have strong families without the security and safety of a home. And also, where does the tax burden fall to fund the things that are most important to society? It shouldn't all fall on middle earners and low earners when you have so many people with very large properties. Why should spending £10,000 on a handbag pay the same amount of tax as someone buying a computer? I think there should be a luxury tax on high value goods.
Okay. Is there anything to disagree with from your perspective there?
He's a bit left wing. Is where I begin, but where I want to begin, and excuse me, is just to say what an honour it is to be here, and to say what to acknowledge the great work that you do, Christian, and the Centre for Social Justice. It's really something that I support hugely, and to recognise the vocation in what you do, and that's, I think, a very important part. It's not just about a job, and it's not just about programmes. I completely agree with how do we, and there's really tough about how do we support families. One of the ideas we were toying with, which got knocked back on the policy review, was giving people, for 5 years of marriage, incentives to virtue. We've got incentives to vice in our society. That's the problem. Is that, the worse you are, the more you're rewarded. And nowhere is that more the case, I think, if you look close up in politics, but it's also the case in the economy, that the more greedy and selfish you are, the more... So to give incentives to people to make the necessary...
One of the ideas you were toying with.
Yes, one of the ideas we were toying with was a weekend away for 5 years of marriage, 2 weeks in Spain for 10 years, and 3 weeks it's something to look forward to.
Paid by the state?
Yeah, paid by the state, can you imagine? And because what we've got to look at is, it's just a small example of just acknowledging the difficulties of staying together, just the importance that people are with you in trying to make relationships and family life work. And so, it didn't pass.
Would you have to go to Spain, or could you go somewhere else?
Let's say a European. We're not going further than that, but maybe the cruise could take you further. But it's just a lack of acknowledgement of the sacrifices and struggles that people have, and that's related to trying to move help to families. With people with autism and disability, the focus is on that person, but the carers, supporting the carers, and genuinely building up those networks of care. These are all very important. But this,
so this good right, you like the sound of it?
Like the sound of it a lot.
Something Tim said was...
Don't be critical of it a little bit, please. Well, down
Well, it's it's just this subversive word good that I think is the thing, to be good and how to be good. Actually undermines the orthodoxies that I think that need to be challenged on the left and on the right. There's a priority on rights, on right, on entitlement, on individual flourishing, but to be good means to be aware and to be responsible to other people. That's the fundamental move. And then there's a focus, which I think is the important area of disagreement, on good work. It's not just about any job that you can get, but doing it well. And skilled work, labour, there we go, labour value, can you imagine such a thing? So a move to a good economy, that's where I think the government have floundered. That's where the disagreements lie. I think that we need state reform, but we also need market reform.
Tim Montgomerie said that the Conservatives don't have a bad story on poverty. Is he right?
It's a mixed story, I would say. First of all, to acknowledge the Conservative tradition has had a commitment to the poor in a way that the Liberal tradition hasn't. And I see, Tim and the Centre for Social Justice is absolutely related to the renewal of that story, which is vital. But the problem has always lied with the whole history of British conservatism since Burke, is that you don't see the vice in the market. That this maximisation of returns on investment, which is the very basis of the system, leads to the exhaustion of people and their environment. So I see a very strong role for resisting the domination. And the second thing is the capital, just to talk about, capital for a moment. I like saying that, capital. It is the capital centralises every bit as much as the state. So not a single one of the demutualised building societies in the 80s and the 90s still exists as an independent entity. They've all been consolidated. Sometimes I joke it's like living, it's my generation's joke, so apologies to young people, The Exorcist, 666. There's 6 banks, there's 6 utility companies, there's 6 of everything. It's the age of the Damien and the oligarchs, would be the way that I would put it. And where is the capital going to the region so that people can set up businesses? Where is the decentralisation of capital that would align to the decentralisation of the state? That's our overwhelming concern. Because without thriving small businesses with genuine access to capital, and that comes then into vocation and access to genuine vocational training that isn't a correlation to university. So what a good education is an education that's about good doing, as well as do gooding.
Are we going to see this reflected in the Labour Party manifesto?
Maybe.
What the sense of responsibility?
I think that what we've got to acknowledge is, that we've got, 3 parties here that are all essentially liberal in form, and that there is disputes going on in each of them about reconnecting to people's everyday lives, which require sacrifice, duty, obligation, and these are very difficult things to talk about. So what we are going to have, I'm sure, in the next 5 weeks is the last gasp of the old state market. That's how it's going to be played out, both in the media, you're responsible to, but also in parties.
But
So, Sarah, can I just
yes, please do.
because Maurice puts it in terms of liberalism and capitalism. So the way I would say the problem with all of the parties at the moment is, or maybe I wouldn't say liberal, although I wouldn't dissent to that. The way I would describe it is that we are dominated by 2 materialist philosophies,
Completely,
rather than relational philosophies. So, for example, did I say something funny?
Yeah, that's me agreeing.
All right. So you have, for example, on the conservative side, which is the capitalist side, if you like, conservatives, capitalists largely see people as consumers, employers, workers, investors, savers. And on the Labour side, which is where the state is perhaps more central to the creed, people are seen as taxpayers, welfare claimants, public sector employees. What we don't have in British politics is a philosophy where the father, the mother, the neighbour, the volunteer, the charity, the philanthropist, any of those people are central. And so what you
Big
have...
society.
Yeah. The big society was a very important idea, never properly expressed and eclipsed by the circumstances which this government inherited. But equally, it wasn't quite enough. I think the big society...
It didn't need to be eclipsed, did it? That was surely down to leadership.
Well, actually, I think it was more important because of the challenge of the circumstances that David Cameron did make it fly. So I agree with you. But the reason I think it didn't was because it was too much about small platoons, the Birkin small platoons. It was too much about charities and society. There wasn't quite enough hard edge to it. There wasn't that practical support for families, teachers, job creators. It didn't quite have, and it didn't have the decentralisation. Maurice is Blue Labour, Philip Blonder's Red Tory, and I think Red Toryism, with its emphasis now on devolution to the cities, what's happening in Manchester at the moment with Devo Mank, as Philip Blond calls it, that is a real, one of the most interesting developments in this government. And actually, if George Osborne stays Chancellor, if the Tories are back, I think he's really got religion almost on this devolution agenda and the northern powerhouse. And I don't know whether that's what Maurice partly means by decentralisation of power, but there's something there where you've got, there's two coalitions in this country. There's the one we all know about in the centre between the Liberal Democrats and the Tories. And then there's the other fascinating coalition between the Labour Cities Minister, Conservative Cities Minister Greg Clark, Lord Heseltine, George Osborne, and leaders of Labour councils throughout the north.
5 biggest Labour councils.
Ed Miliband telling these Labour council leaders not to cooperate with Tory ministers and then telling him where to go. This is a fascinating partnership.
Now, I want to pick up on something you'd said just before, which was that what we're going to see in the next 5 weeks is the last gasp of state versus market, the old form of politics. I mean, there's so many things that follow that. First of all, what's going to happen after the election? The suggestion from what you're saying is that politics as it is now cannot continue.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's not expressing the reality of the beauty and the difficulties of people's lives. There's no simple answer.
Can it ever do that?
Yeah, politics is that. Politics is about how we build a common good. See, it's the common good that's the crucial phrase that I'm now lobbing into the...
Which is the foundation you're involved with.
Yeah, and it's also the politics that I'm involved with. How do you build a common life between immigrants and locals, between rich and poor, between capital and labour, which is vital. There's a story going on all the time about unions, which are very important thing. But go back to this big...
Can I just a little interrupt? The big society is part of the answer, and I know that you were a bit of a fan of the big society, weren't you? I think you thought it was only the Labour Party that could have actually introduced it properly.
Yeah, but the big society didn't just flounder on a lack of implementation. So the work that I'm involved with, I used to be very involved with, you get people together overwhelmingly through churches and other faith institutions. And you get them together and you get them talking, and what are they concerned about? It's about work, and it's about pay. I mean, the living wage is what pay. You get a Christian, a Muslim, black church, trade unionist, and what are they concerned about? Cleaners, cooks, security guards, contracting out, poor conditions. So they take the argument to the market. Now, I don't think the big society, it was all about the political power and not about challenging the concentration of economic power. And that's vital. But to just say exactly, to reiterate, the big politics is going to change, the transforming power, and I think Christian's book, which I read quite a bit of, in between the talks while I was having a cigarette outside, was, because addiction takes many forms. It's not all bad. It's about the transformative power of relationships. This is it. And what we have is two systems. One precisely an economic system and the other the political administrative system that pay no regard and dissolve relationships. Rowan Williams said it very well, I thought, recently, when he said, well, you know, for 60 years we've had two governing ideologies, essentially statism and the market, or, you know, let's say 45, 79, that work against the grain of human nature. Human nature is a longing to connect, a longing to, so this relational, and this relational power is a democratic power as well. So there's money power and state power, and then there's this relational power. And it got lost a bit in volunteering rather than in people coming together and doing things and changing their lives. So these were the sands that it ran into. But I was very supportive, of course, of a stronger society, and I'd be very interested to talk about what that would mean.
Okay, and you slightly had a go at the media for ensuring that the conversation ends up bland, and you know, may well be very right there. But it's partly because of what they're dealing with as well.
Oh, you're not solely responsible for any.
But I wonder, both of you, whether you look at the nature of political discussion, because have I ever heard, I mean, obviously you've been in the studio talking about the common good and the good right.
Yeah.
It's not something that one ever hears politicians particularly talking about. Is that a fair suggestion? I can see a few raised eyebrows. I hope I don't know if you're shaking. Is that an unfair thing to say? This is the kind of thing that one imagines certain think tanks and groups and religious groups, but not politicians saying, look, this is the common good. This is what would be good for society. Am I unfair?
Marginally. And it's not. So certainly it is the case that in every speech that's given in the last 2 years, the person I'm representing here, John Cardos, has been talking about the necessity of moving towards a common good.
I have tried to get John Cardos on the Today programme an awful lot. He won't do it.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Well, that's why you wouldn't hear of it then. But after you go to bed...
Beyond John Cardos. Beyond John Cardos.
After you go to bed and everybody else gets up. By the way, it's interesting fact, people who do an apprenticeship go up an hour and a half earlier than people who've been to university. I thought I'd share, something to think.
Do they go to bed earlier?
They do go to bed earlier, yeah. It's just...
But hold on, can we get back to that?
Sorry.
Just the public discourse, what you hear. Yes, John Cardos, and I've heard John Cardos talk about it, but away from John Cardos, Tim, what are your, the nasty party, the Conservatives, as you...
Well, I think there are, speaking on the Conservative side, there are people like Ian Duncan Smith who do try and explain the moral purpose of what they're doing. And Ian's battle within the government has been really interesting. And I think he would say that there was a big emphasis, understandably, from the Treasury. I'll just say the Treasury, that they wanted cuts. And what he wanted was reform. He said you had to have a reforming agenda, not just a cutting agenda.
You put it in the past tense, they still want cuts from the welfare.
They do, and I think it's not wise of the Conservatives to propose £12 billion of cuts in the welfare budget and not give a clue to voters as to where those cuts are going to fall. I wrote this in the Times on Monday, so forgive any Times readers who've already heard this, but there is a big difference between welfare cuts that, for example, involve restricting child benefit for larger families and taxing disability benefits, which is not something either thing you would want to do in ideal circumstances, but somehow are related to income or factors within people's control. And, for example, further freezes in work benefits for families that are already only just about on the right side of hardship. And just as Labour have a reputation for fiscal irresponsibility and therefore should face some very tough questions about how they're going to close the deficit, the Tories, who have a reputation for an inadequate heart, have to answer these questions on welfare.
And that idea of a moral purpose, which in a way, the politics so often seems to be about, it's almost like the bidding war. We'll give you tax breaks, or we'll give you tax breaks. These are the groups that we're going to... rather than sort of setting out some moral purpose for society. I mean, is that... Who do we blame for that? Who do we turn to try to get that articulated?
I think part of the problem is that the way politicians talk, and I won't blame the media for this, you've already had enough flack, but the politicians are held to account very much for performance indicators, how many extra jobs have been created, and how much extra money they're spending on X, Y, and Z. We live in a sort of very target-driven, materialistic culture, and it's almost like politicians have started to talk in those terms because that's how they are judged. And what they don't often have an opportunity to do is to stand back, and tell the story of what they think the good life, the common good is. And for Labour, it is often about providing a larger state, more protection, more safety net, more security through that. And what we don't hear from the Conservatives, and I think this is a big weakness, is their story of what makes the good life. Is it just about a bigger economy, or is there something else there as well?
And is it a story that you hear from politicians they want to tell, they're just not given the space to tell it?
Well, Michael Gove, for example, tried to tell it 3 or 4 weeks ago in his speech about, Christian quoted it a little while ago, the warriors of, wanting Conservatives to become the warriors of the dispossessed, and he talked about the state as a great emancipator throughout history. He talked about the role of family, he talked about the incredible transformational power of education for lifting people out of the poverty trap. Let's just say that there were people in number 10 Downing Street. I won't mention any names, but they might have been from Australia, who weren't happy at that message, because the polling evidence is that you win elections with incredibly simplistic messages. You talk about long-term economic plan. Bingo, that's a point for me, I'll give anyone for that. You talk about how awful Ed Miliband and weird Ed Miliband is. But actually, if you introduce a complicated thing, particularly late in the campaign, we have such short attention spans as voters, we don't notice it. And it's this sort of talk about poverty generally, it's the poverty of the discourse which makes this
Can I ask
hard.
you mentioned an Australian there. That name, Linton Crosby's name, comes up, so often as if, and I constantly wonder, could you literally move one person and a lot of the problems would be, or the sort of poison would be removed? I mean, it happens on both sides.
Yeah. Well, look, when Linton Crosby became campaign director of the Conservative Party in about 2012, the Conservative Party was on the brink of meltdown. You remember the really bad times that it had after George Osborne was booed at the Paralympics, etc. And Linton Crosby is one of the very few people who David Cameron and George Osborne trust, and Tory backbenchers trust. And without him, I actually think the Conservative Party could easily have had quite a serious meltdown. So he is a person who's performed a good service for the Conservative Party, at least. But he is...
messaging, I mean, it's just, I'm not being cynical, actually, and I didn't mean to make an ad hominem attack. It's just this idea that one person can exert such influence that they are controlling the message.
Well, the Conservative Party has not won a general election since 1992. There is no one in the Conservative family, no MP, no strategist, who can tell an unhappy Tory MP or an unhappy party leader, this is the way it's going to be, and anyone take that person particularly seriously, because there's no one in the party, because of that track record of defeat, with that authority. Linton Crosby's won Australian elections, he's won mayoral elections in London, and so he has an authority that people can't compete with. He is unusual in that sense. I'm not sure the situation is quite the same in the Labour Party.
Who is the guiding force at the moment in the Labour Party? Because here you are. Tell us about the process of writing a manifesto or being involved in a manifesto.
Should be Maurice.
Yeah, well...
Because you've been critical of the narrative before about the lack of narrative.
It's the lack of narrative. This is the point. So one of the things I've learned in my 5 years in politics is that I used to be told growing up, where there's a will, there's a way, But what I realise is that only where there's a way is there a will. And we've just lost the general sense of what is wrong and what to do. This is the problem. This is why, Tim, I think we get locked down into quite
I'm looking
petty.
at Twitter by the Twitter fall. I'm not ignoring you. I thought I'd retweet something Christian just retweeted.
Oh. And I thought you were being really...
I was fascinated by what you were saying, can I tell you? He's on Twitter. You can retweet from Christian later. And then everybody else can, don't go on Twitter. That was just fascinating what you were about to say.
That is so kind of you, Sarah.
I'm genuine.
But it's incredible. People are very rude. And they keep on looking at their phones and they're sending to Twitter, but in fact they're checking their emails and they're sending messages, and I know that.
There's 2-0 in the game. No.
Well, Spurs aren't playing, so that's okay.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
Only where there's a way is there a will. That's the crucial thing. So
the way is what? The narrative,
so
the
what
story?
we've got to acknowledge is that our wonderful and beautiful country is in a great deal of distress. And this is the parallel life. It's not just a story going on in Scotland. There's a story of disenchantment, of dispossession, of demoralisation, and a demoralisation of the lives of the poor, and a huge anxiety in everyday life among so many people. So there's a loss of a sense that there's something better, a loss of a sense of a good, of a general good, which requires sacrifice, which you're participating in. So what you have is answers that nobody believes. That there's going to be these, policy changes that are going to result. It's not going to be that way. What there needs to be is a renewal of institutions. We need to speak about, growing up, there was a real trust in certain institutions. I think there was a trust in institutions like the BBC, for example, and then you get Jimmy Savile. And people are just, it feels like a rupture of trust. So, one of the ways I put it is we have to move from contract to covenant, in thinking about intergenerational renewal and the sacrifice required from everybody to pursue that good.
And it's so much more that I so agree with what's just been said. It's incredibly important for how the rich behave as well. I think one of the things that was so toxic for the Tories recently was the black and white law. Some of you may remember it. And you had, I don't know who in Conservative HQ thought it was a good idea 2 or 3 months before an election to have people turning up in pink Rolls Royce to bid hundreds of thousands of pounds for holidays in exotic locations, and the flaunting of wealth without sort of any sense of how tough it is for other people in the middle of a recession. With wealth comes responsibility. As Wesley said, it's one of my favourite quotes. Earn as much as you can, save as much as you can, give as much as you can. Where is the covenantal relationship between the wealthy to the rest of society, rather than just the contractual relationship? And this, where are we seeing examples, not just of the poor getting richer, but the rich getting poorer? Where are the banks and the people who got very wealthy in the past? Where are they suffering for when they make mistakes? And it's the lack of downward mobility that I think brings capitalism into disrepute, as well as the lack of upward mobility.
Okay, so what is going to happen at the election then, in terms of parties?
Well, one thing I can say for sure is that the Conservatives will maintain their electoral track record of not winning. I think this is
hold on a second. Do you agree with that? Do you agree with that? They won't win outright. They won't win outright. Will they? Do you think they'll get enough to get a minority government?
Well, I think, can we come back in 2 weeks' time? Because one thing...
2 weeks' time?
About 2 weeks' time, I think we should know. Because remember last time, I remember the last general election, we had opinion poll after opinion poll predicting a hung parliament. And I didn't believe it because we'd had about 2-3 years of big David Cameron opinion poll leads. I sort of got it into my head that the Conservatives would, prevail and would get a majority. But after a certain point, we should have realised actually the opinion polls were pretty clear. And I think in the Conservative minds for a very long time, there's been this view, Ed Miliband, it cannot be elected. You look at the opinion polls now, again and again and again, they are predicting, because they're level pegging, this will probably mean that Labour and the SNP will be a lot bigger than the Liberals and the Conservatives. If the opinion polls are basically still saying that in 2 weeks' time, you've got to start thinking this is a real possibility. And that frightens me. I generally think that an Ed Miliband government will be very bad for the country. But we're 2 weeks away from beginning to concede that might be where we are. If we don't see something start to move in the opinion poll, if the Tory manifesto is as dull as the campaign messages so far, they haven't got anything to move the needle. The budget was a bit of a disappointment. No, I worry where the campaign is going.
Okay. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think it will be. I think Labour will probably be the largest party, and it will be hung. Nobody's going to win, and that's because nobody is presenting a genuine vision of how to renew the institutions, how to a part that people can play in the country. There's very little participation going on in here. The whole, what Tim just said, the whole thing about relationships. Also, just to go back to the earlier point, which we were talking about, virtuous elites. You know, this is a conversation that needs to be had. I think a very straw in the wind was, I thought that the pastoral letter of the bishops of the Church of England was actually a beautiful letter, and it did acknowledge the failures of 45. It also acknowledged the failures of 97. But there needs to be a politics of a common good. But that was trashed. It was trashed by the Conservatives as being a lefty document. Okay. So we've got to a point where there are real malfunctions in the economic system that are not being acknowledged.
Okay, so your prediction is that you reckon that Cameron will just get over the line or not? No?
I think he will, because I think there will be a bit of a swing in the campaign. But there isn't much evidence of it yet.
Okay, and your money would be on Ed Miliband getting over the line?
No, neither are going to get over the line.
But
Labour would be the largest party, I think, is a real possibility. And then it becomes complicated. So I'm obviously a great heretic in these things. You know, I've always been in favour of the coalition with the Conservatives. You know, but that's just something I think would be to the good. There's constitutional issues.
How interesting. So the good of the country, you would say that Ed Miliband should turn to David Cameron and say,
well, there's going to have to be a new constitutional settlement. This cannot. I believe in the ancient constitution and the renewal of the ancient constitution, and this new constitution can't be a factional party issue. There has to be a genuine agreement on all sides. And I also think that there is, if you look underneath it all, if you look at what Tim said earlier, a reform of the welfare state rather than simply a dismantling or a cutting of the welfare state. Where is the conversation here about what's absolutely necessary about contribution, about the necessity of contribution and ownership of people of that contribution, and how we conceive of all that? Thirdly, about education, about the necessity of a vocational education as part of it. All of these are huge national issues. And
so you would favour him forming some sort of national unity?
You have to, well, I call it the war cabinet. You know, I say it worked well in the Second World War. You know, Churchill and Attlee was a very good...
And when you voiced that to him?
No, that's not a good conversation. That's not good.
Does that just stay in your head, that conversation, typically?
No. These issues have to be raised, and they're raised. So
what happens?
So what I just want to articulate, what happens is, you know what, and anyway we're going to win. So the conversation doesn't go much further. I just talked about this.
What do you say? Sorry, when we're going to win? Does anybody raise your eyebrows?
Well, what I usually stick on is how are we going to, if you want this constitutional convention and you want a discussion of the constitution, then you've got to have the participation of your opponents in that. That's got to be a genuine consensus between parties.
Well, what the direction seems to be heading is the participation of opponents in Scotland, the SNP.
Yeah, well, I oppose that.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But that's also, it's not just that I oppose the coalition with the SNP, is that, you know, there isn't a progressive majority in the country. There isn't. So what there has to be is we have to move and be able, this is Labour, has to be able to talk again to the people, well, the ancestors of the people who created the party, which is the working class. They are the most ambivalent. This is where we haven't talked yet about UKIP and what is the basis of UKIP. But that is a cry of huge dissatisfaction with both mainstream parties that I think needs to be talked about. And just that's part
And
of
do
the
you think it will be expressed in this election that the UKIP will do well?
Well, what I think will be, this is just going on the evidence of my visits. I try to get out of London once a week, not just to go to Australia, you know, to go to other places that look a bit like Australia, you know, like Grimsby. And, you know, east coast by the sea, it's got everything except the sunshine. And when you get, what you see is that there are a huge number of Labour voters who are voting UKIP. I've been to ex-mining villages. So our attack on UKIP, that they're just the Tories in disguise, isn't working at all in those areas. So what I think is that UKIP will move into second place in a huge number of Labour constituencies in the north, and then in southern constituencies, Tory-held constituencies in the south. And when a party is in second place, that means that the election after next is the vital election there. And that's why I think that after this election, both Tim's party and my party have to have a thorough reckoning with our inability to connect with the people of the country. And it's not about principles, it's about, so this relational thing means you go to where the people are. And where the people are is that they don't feel supported by either party in the struggles that they face to honour their obligations to their loved ones and to honour their obligations to their country. And that's a huge rupture that needs to be healed, and nothing straightforward about that other than organising, building leaders from those communities who bring people with them, who take responsibility, and who are prepared to say the difficult things to everybody. So I wrote an article, it's different to Tim. The most popular political figure, the most popular public figure in Europe is the Pope. This is an incredible, this has never happened in our lifetime. No, God, not at all. Pope is a very divisive figure, particularly in England. But now it's really huge popularity, and that's because he is prepared to challenge powerful interests on all sides, reform his own institution, has made enormous changes in the Vatican as regards their finances, has frozen the beatification accounts and done all manner of things, and that resonates with people as something good. So one of the strange things we're witnessing, just to say, is this is the first time for 400 years the Catholic ideas are moving into the mainstream of the importance of virtuous elites, institutions, sacrifice.
Where are you on UKIP and its likely success in the election?
I think there's evidence that it's fading a little bit, but I think there's been a misunderstanding of its potency by, I think, most of the mainstream parties. And the idea, and I'm a little bit guilty of this in the past, so point the finger at myself as well, but it isn't largely a Eurosceptic phenomenon. It is a phenomenon of people who feel that globalization and the current system doesn't work for them. That people, we had a reduction in incomes for large numbers of people. Even before the recession struck, there was something going wrong with certain wage remuneration for certain kinds of categories of workers that was going wrong. They feel the system's not working. It's interesting, Douglas Carswell represents Clacton, and most UKIP, the demographics of Clacton are very UKIP friendly, and the CSJ has done its report on seaside towns. There are communities, there are types of workers, and there are locations which are doing very well, doing very badly from the current way the economy and the system is structured. And I think, and that's why
they are feeling marginalised. They are the ones who are feeling that UKIP will stand for them because they feel.
And then you have a Labour Party and a Conservative Party, which is pouring all of its resources in our electoral system into a few marginal seats, largely worrying about middle-class voting voters. And UKIP, the voters that UKIP are championing, felt completely underrepresented. And they've risen up. Finally, they've got a champion. And of course, immigration, we haven't mentioned immigration yet, but that is what, rightly or wrongly, people, there are racists behind some people who object to immigration, but a lot of it is just this feeling that a lot of people are coming into the country, and people connect that with depressed wages, rising house prices, and cultural confusion, and a lack of solidarity. They don't know their neighbours, they don't talk to them, they're not connected. And so there's a very important cultural as well as economic dimension to what we're seeing with the UKIP's rise too.
You've got in trouble before for your views on immigration, haven't you?
I have, yes.
Because actually, I mean, broadly, you support the Cameron position of renegotiating the European deal.
Well, there has to be a renegotiation of the European deal, and that's because this idea that you have a free market between places that have wages a third of ours and us, automatically means that people will come, and there's been a real lack of regard for two groups in the society. One is skilled workers, and the other is the old. And they both fit, and this is part of the UK demographic. It's overwhelmingly private sector workers and old people who feel that they're not valued at all in the decisions that are made. So part of this demanding category of the common good is to give a leading role to old people. I mean, and this is very hard, but this is vital as repositories of wisdom, and to honour skilled work, and to recognise that there hasn't been any value given to those things.
I'm going to come out for questions in a moment. I just want to ask you both, really. We're going to see change in leadership in a few weeks' time, depending, of course, on the outcome. I wonder, actually, in a way, if the good right has its greatest chance of purchase and being taken up by the Conservative Party if Cameron goes.
We're ready for either eventuality. He wins, or whether he... Well, let's hope he wins, and I really do hope he wins. If he loses, that's a big opportunity for the Conservative Party to have a massive debate. Because, sorry to sound rude about Ed Miliband, but if the Conservative Party loses to Ed Miliband, it will regard it as a huge defeat. You know, the Conservative Party, 80% of Tory members, according to Conservative polls, expect to win this election. It will be a real shell shock to the Tory psyche to lose to Ed Miliband. Couldn't beat Gordon Brown, haven't won a general election since 1992. So, the good right hopefully will fit into that. But even
and
then,
will be pushing, encouraging for who to take over from David Cameron?
Well, I have a personal view of who that should be.
Which
but the good right is much more important, I think.
Well,
if I may say so. The agenda is more important than the person. If the person doesn't believe in this agenda, that's
So, which the good right would support who? Theresa May, recognising the nasty party? Boris Johnson? George Osborne?
Well, I don't criticise Theresa May in the presence of Christian Gallagher. The work they've done on the modern slavery bill is enormous, but I would like someone exuding optimism, a record of achievement, perhaps in a major capital city. Someone who can appeal to Labour voters, who has won an election in a non-Tory area for the first time since,
and won't be seen as a rich Etonian.
I think that the person who might be mentioned, it defies categorisation. But to answer your question, even if the Tories win, there's a lot of awareness. It's the same point, really. It won't be much of a victory to, in a lot of Conservatives' eyes, to beat Ed Miliband. The Conservative Party will know it's been lucky, and it will know that it will face a stronger Labour opposition in the future. There is a lot of unhappiness throughout the Tory machine at the limited intellectual vision of what we're currently offering the people. There will be a reinvention anyway, and David Cameron won't last to 2020, and I think he will probably go in 2017 after the European referendum. So there's going to have to be a reinvention in opposition or in government.
And you want a reinvention of your party. Can you see that reinvention happening under Ed Miliband?
Yeah, so just to say, and this is genuine, is that Ed Miliband has been very good to me. So I just, declare that in that he's really allowed this quite difficult strain to move along in the party. And when it's come to very significant things, for example, John Cruddas getting the manifesto and the policy review, but also underneath the surface, the moves towards decentralisation, and also something that hasn't happened in Labour for a very long time, some recognition and acceptance of faith communities as having something to say. These things don't get reported, but he's really brokered the opening of those those spaces. And so I recognise him a bit differently to you, as someone who's actually...
I'm not saying he's not that way, I'm just saying that is the perception of him, right, amongst Tories, right or wrong.
So this hasn't
Having
been...
said that...
This hasn't, what I'm saying is that this hasn't been, so what, just to go on my party's political moment, which
I thought there was a but coming,
yes.
This is going to be the...
No, it is that, what I'm drawing attention to is that it's not resolved. This issue of whether we're ultimately a statist party or whether there's some acknowledgement of what, the joke I always make is, our name is Labour and we're supposed to be socialist. Our name is not the slightly left of centre progressive globalisation party. And we're not the statist.
Your jokes, it's very special.
And we're not the statist party. We're not a party that exclusively... Labour was born in resistance to the poor law state. In many ways, what we have now is the poor law state. So these are issues. So
it's not resolved.
What I'm saying is it's not resolved, but what I draw attention to is that it's alive. Is that there hasn't been a killing of this debate, and it goes on. So what's going to happen after May the 8th is that there's going to be a continued reckoning, and what that's going to throw up is what kind of government will be if we are, and whether it's going to be a patriotic government that pursues the common good or a progressive coalition that's tied to particular interests that isn't generous in its relationship to business and doesn't have the necessary relationship to the institutions, not necessarily the state institutions, that are necessary for the renewal of vocation and virtue in the lives of the poor, which is what this is about. So the move to compassion is the central issue, and I would say that both parties have it, but they're not the dominant strains.
Okay, let's get some questions out of you. Loads of questions. Goodness. We've got 2 microphones. Can I ask that you be concise as possible and direct? We'll try and get quite a few questions, so we'll keep it pacey. Sorry, gentleman there eagerly with the hand up. And let's get the microphone to the gentleman at the front. Oh, actually, one name afterwards.
I'm Phil Macaulay from Movement for Change. I noticed that your debate tonight is Compassionate British Politics, who will stand for the poorest after May 2015. Isn't it time for a Cabinet Minister for Social Justice and a Minister for the Poor?
What about that idea? Lord Glasman?
Well, I mean, I would say in insurgent mode that was supposed to be the Labour movement generally would supposed to be that. I think that's a good idea, but I think we've also got to wean ourselves away from the idea that just appointing a minister for these things resolves them.
But don't we have to challenge the Cabinet? Isn't that your whole contention?
Yeah, we
So why not enshrine it? Who's guarding the guardians?
right.
In the Conservative Party, somebody said that it should be the first point before you create any law that you should think about how it's going to affect the poor. I'm strong enough who said that. And then it just disappeared without trace. I mean, are you in favour of having one person?
No, I'm not. I think for the same reasons Maurice is really. I think you want your education secretary, you want your chancellor, you want your work and pensions person, you want your international. All of them should be so. Perhaps it's the
But they don't, so here's the whole point.
Well, they don't perhaps because they're not convinced, or perhaps because the politics of it don't. But you're not going to solve that by having a social justice.
Your argument is to change the culture of the
cabinet, absolutely,
rather than having...
So no social justice, okay.
Well, we obviously didn't say that.
Yes, you did.
Gentleman over here.
Thank you. I'm Robin Gwynn here with the Clean Sheet charity, putting ex-offenders into jobs and so on. I think the apparent agreement between you both on lots of things actually covers a much deeper issue, which is the difference really between the values that I think all the parties and the leaders share, but the means to actually achieve them. And I think that's where the really transformational stuff is happening in the Tory party and society through Ian Duncan Smith and so on. And just to illustrate, I'll say I think there was an excellent article in Conservative Home recently looking at the UK aid programme, and it was saying where we have an avowed objective to reduce poverty and increase wealth abroad. Guess what we do with our money? We actually set up education and training and job-creating schemes. One thing we don't do is set up welfare schemes in other countries. Now, I'm not against that, but I think that just illustrates the way I think our society can change, and perhaps should do, and that's covered by your apparent agreements.
Okay. A question or comment? Let's get the microphone to the gentleman there in the red tie, and then we'll get this one to the lady there.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm struggling with a cold here. Gareth from the Salvation Army. I've heard you both before, you're both brilliant. It's fantastic to hear the consensus. But this intriguing idea of a national government between Labour and the Conservatives. So let's imagine you're in the Cabinet Office Committee Room A, and you've both been appointed by your respective party leaders to hammer out the next coalition agreement. You've both spoken here and previously about what you want policy-wise. Could each of you name a policy that would be your red line, that you would really want, one from the right, one from the left, that would be a great, compassionate policy for this national government?
Mine would be house building. No, absolutely. We've just got to turn around the fact that so many people cannot get on the housing ladder, home ownership down to its lowest level since 1986 and still declining. I think family is central to my vision of politics, and we can't keep families together if the wait to get a home is so long. People are in cramped accommodation. We have the smallest houses in Europe. We have such debt associated with people who can own a home. We have such insecurity of tenure with people who are renting. Unless we have a transformational policy on house building, which includes state subsidy of house building, but also include massive deregulation of the planning sector. So I'm afraid unless Maurice agreed to that, the deal would be off.
But in a way, that's an area where one can imagine both parties probably finding an agreement
Should we
pretty...
just give an indication of how this negotiation would proceed? So I would say that what that has to be based is on the model of the community land trust, where there's a transfer of land assets to people, that there should be incentives for people, poor people of all different backgrounds, to make a contribution to that. But if you transfer the land title, then that reduces the cost of the house by 50%. And then you can start having poor people who now don't own, and I worked on this in America with the Nehemiah Homes in East Brooklyn. It was transformative for me, was to see they did a double collection in the churches every week, double collection. And then they had something to bring to the table. So this was kind of my turning point. When I saw that, so the poor were involved in designing the houses, so I thought, oh, this will be interesting. And what did they want? It was a real lesson for me. They wanted a townhouse with a front garden and a back. They wanted what I wanted, garden. Backward people. And that was really interesting. So this idea of asset transfer, and then an actual role for people not as passive recipients of this house building. I've got a few concerns about what I call Gresham-like house building, which unleashes the developers and the state.
If the houses that we build are not beautiful and attractive, it's counterproductive.
Good.
We may succeed.
Okay.
So then we can work on that. Yeah.
Okay. But what would your policy be?
I would pass a company law that any company of 100 employees would have a third workers on the board.
Oh, so we might be running into trouble.
Yeah. But that's just about respecting labour values.
I can imagine you two are pretty easy to come to some agreement. How would it work? I can really see it working.
But that was just my gift to the meeting tonight, just to get out of the conversation. What I'm drawing attention to is, and this is part of it, is that if we are thinking about a really transformational politics, then we have to be transgressive, and there has to be consensus on these things, and we have to actively build that. So in terms of vocational education, in terms of constitution, in terms of institutions and the autonomy of institutions, such as our great universities and the Bank of England, and these things, there has to be a new settlement. This is a big deal, a new settlement, and the idea that you could broker this new settlement without a reconciliation of estranged interests, and part of that reconciliation is with your political independence.
Lady there, and let's get this. Is there a microphone there? Can we get it down to the gentleman at the front?
Susanna Absey, Tavistock Centre for Couple Relationships. It's a simple question. Who in this election is going to be able to lay claim to be the party of the family?
I mean, I presume, party, who's the party of the family?
I think it's interesting how good the cooperation between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats has been on employment and education. But there is a big difference between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats on how they conceive of the family. So the Conservatives got the married tax allowance into the coalition agreement, but Nick Clegg doesn't support it. And there is a lack of achievement, therefore, really, I think, on the family from a Conservative perspective. There's been a little bit more investment in relationship education, but not the transformational investment that I think there would have been, for example, if Ian Duncan Smith was working inside a Conservative government. And I think partly because there's an embarrassment and a lack of progress, the Conservative Party isn't going to talk too much about the family in the election. I think Labour, I think, are largely indifferent to family structure. I think if you look at a book like Our Kids that's just come out, Robert Putnam's new book, and he talks about what's powering inequality is the collapse of the families, the working class family. That conversation, other than from people like Maurice, isn't happening in the Labour Party. Inequality is an awful lot more serious than the left realises, because it isn't facing up to what's happening in the family.
Well, it's not quite like that, but what I would say, just to answer your question, and one of the reasons why it's a bit more complicated than you're suggesting, so it's a good anecdote. It's about organising movement for changes here. So when Arnie Graf, who's an organiser who's trained me, came over, he was very struck by the inability to listen that was manifest, let's say, in Labour Party activist organisers. So we did a timing, and the average length of time it took between a member of the public telling us what they cared about and us telling them that they were wrong was 8 seconds. Right? So no, I'm worried about immigration. No, you're not. You're worried about education. You're worried about jobs. That was one of the reasons just to make the sort of interventions that I thought had to be made. And then, in order to do the training, we did sort of 5,000 one-to-one conversations in the northwest of England about what people cared about. So not what they wanted, what they cared about. And what was really interesting was that family was number one by a street. Things haven't changed, so this is one of the interesting things, is we talk about change all the time, but when it comes to what do people care about, how to look after their parents, how to care for their children, who are they desperately worried about that, and even how to make things work with each other. Now, I just say, number one was family, number two was place. The place they lived in, which was supposed to be abolished by the internet somehow. And number three, which shouldn't have been a shock to us, was work. So just say in the policy review, we did build it around family, place and work as those three themes organised the policy review. And it did go through, and it did. So what I'm saying is there is an ambivalence about...
Did it come out the other end, though? I mean,
it's coming out the other end. That's the point. There is an ambivalence there about patriarchy. There is still an insistence that the ultimate unit is the individual outside of relationships. These are long-term difficulties, but what I would say that was definitely present and is still ongoing is there is an understanding now that what matters to people is love and the obligations that flow from love, and then the heartbreak of rupture in those relationships. So I would say that I'm just...
But to answer the question was, which is part of the family, and I know...
Yeah, and I would say that...
Can you say it's Labour?
Not quite. That's what I'm saying. I'm trying to answer sincerely that it's more than it used to be, but it's neither party is talking about the difficulties. Family is not to be used as a political trait. The difficulties of honouring your obligations.
No party can claim to be part of family until they address that housing issue.
Yeah.
Right. And one thing, when that training that you did with the 8 seconds before somebody listens, which is relatively long, isn't my usual. By the end of the training, what was it?
45 seconds. And now what happened when you left that space of 45 seconds? was quite transformative of the conversation, because it forced people who are not used to listening to listen. And I'm sure you face these
45 seconds
issues.
up. Gentleman at the front. Sorry.
You made reference
What's
to...
your name, sorry?
Oliver Scott. You made reference to a letter from the church, and I recently read a book called On Rock or Sand by the Archbishop of York, which was great, I thought, and touched on a lot of sort of key issues. But my question is, what role, if any, does the church have in compassion in British politics?
Well, if I may go first as a Jew, it's huge, and what we've got, the church is in need of renewal, but these ideas of that the church is present in every area of our country and preserves a sense of place. The church has preserved a sense of a vocation, which is going to have to be strengthened. So I think that there is, the big issue maybe, Tim, but I would like to say is that we haven't got a politics that leaves a civic inheritance to our children. What is it that we're going to pass on that's good and it should be a parliament that's committed to liberty and democracy and churches that preserve a sense of, there are really interesting things, Sarah, that this is an important one. Where do people think they live corresponds much more to the Church of England parish map of 1530 than it does to the present political map of administrative units. People say that they're from very particular places, not from Hackney or Tower Hamlets, but from Staveley or Stamford Hill, they're from Peckham. And the parish map is still the imaginative map of the country, so it's not just what we learn from the church, but the church is still held to an ancient imagination of the country that still holds true to people. So the answer is a lot.
Okay. You can feel the Conservative Party get nervous every time the churches say something.
Yeah, and I think with good reason, actually. And I read On Rock and Sand as well, and reached different conclusions, I think, from you. I think the problem, I read the bishop's letter and wasn't as impressed as Maurice either. So if you look at what the church does at the parish level, it's fantastic. The church is involved in caring for people, very vulnerable people, on a scale that no other voluntary organisation matches, and no problem isn't being solved by the church somewhere. Its innovation is extraordinary. But I read the bishop's letter, I read that book, and I read masses on the failures of the market. I almost read nothing on the failures of the state and the consequences of welfare state for the family, the consequences of the welfare state for work incentives. There is a bias in the church thinking, which sees a lot of wrong in the market but can't see the same in the state. And what the church should be calling politics to is, I think, what we've been discussing, calling people to a more relational view rather than a materialistic view. And I don't hear enough of that from the church. What I hear enough, again and again from bishops is, why aren't you spending enough money? And that we've got plenty of people in society saying that.
Okay, let's get some more questions, if I may. I don't know, whoever's closest to you with their hand up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rory Brooks. If you, our moderator, had been John Humphreys, I don't think Christian Guy would have introduced you in quite the honeyed tones that he managed to introduce you, so thank you for that. Does politics feel or believe that it should be adopting, be the moral codifier for society? The Judeo-Christian religions are lesser followed than they were 100 years ago, been replaced by various other things, but there is a vacuum there. Does the body politic feel it should be inheriting that vacuum? Does it want it? Should it have it? And who gives it the authority to take it?
My word, we've only got a minute.
But in fairness, the comment was that the various forms of government we've had have not fulfilled that role because they do not reflect human nature. Sadly, I think it does reflect human nature. So the question is, should politics be adopted? Does it have a moral duty?
Who wants to kick off on that? Jim?
Well, two answers. First of all, I think even though there's, we are probably one of the most secular states in the advanced Western world now, but you still, again and again in the public discourse, fairness is still rooted, I think, in the British identity, and people do have a sense of wanting their politics to be more than sink or swim. They don't want social Darwinism. Maybe we're living off a capital that's being depleted, but I think people still want a morality to their politics. So politicians who don't respond to that will fail. But my second point is I think we want our morality and our concern for our neighbour on the cheap. You know, it is much easier. Marvin Olasky, who wrote the best book I think on public policy and compassion, he talks about a feed and forget compassion. You know, it's the teachers and the education establishment that give people soft grades rather than honesty in their exams. It's the parents who give their children toys rather than time. It's the state that gives people welfare rather than work. Now, there are ways of us thinking that we've given people the right help, and actually we haven't. And I think, you know, we are called to love our neighbour, not just the state to love our neighbour in an adequate way. And until actually we have social forms where we take responsibility to the people in need and not just give it to a state that will never do it properly, then, you know, we can't really claim to be a properly compassionate society.
Okay, so I'm going to be a bit complicated and say that I make a distinction between the state and the body politic, and that what we've had is a desiccation of that body politic. Universities, church, town, you know, self-governing cities, corporations, self-governing corporations. So what's needed really is a revival of vocational and locational institutions that do demand a good, that are repositories of moral value, that uphold a good. Just to reiterate what Tim said, that must always resist the centralising state as much as the centralising market, and I think it's to get that balance right. I've just had a caveat that in that pastoral letter there was a criticism of welfare and those things, and I really welcomed that move.
It was minor though, whereas the emphasis on criticising the market was disproportionate.
Yeah, I would say that it had a slightly harder, in boxing terms, yeah, it had a slightly harder right than left. But what I'm saying is that the state should be the ultimate body that adjudicates, but what we need to have is a much more vital institutions of society, and that takes a great deal more burden. That does do these things that Tim said, that actually opens the space for people to meet, that reconciles the estranged interests that aren't talking, and generates a sense of earning and belonging.
Because if you have that, it would be less need for the state to do it, because it would be existing more widely and...
That's right, and a sense of mutual sacrifice.
If you two were running, it would be all right. But it doesn't feel that way when you talk to politicians.
Just a final thought. I'm afraid we're out of time for questions. And God, we could go anywhere with this final thought, but I suppose it's a sort of where we are at the moment. You know, we've got 5 weeks of sort of, I don't know how you feel at the start of this election campaign, and it's exciting, but it's also quite, I mean, both of you talk about sort of disillusionment and slightly depressed about the way it's being fought out. What are your thoughts just about the best that we can hear in the weeks ahead, and I suppose the worst?
Yeah, it's a bizarre election because it is fascinating in the sense we don't know the results, and the number of permutations are extraordinary. So that makes it exciting. But we're talking about debates, we're talking about dodgy candidates, we're endlessly talking about opinion polls. The lack of discussion of issues is just so frustrating. And there are big challenges that this country faces. And yet, I didn't hear your interview with the Prime Minister this morning, I'm afraid. But, you know, where
yeah, really elevated the discussion.
We went to university, didn't do vocational training.
But maybe something will change with the manifestos, but it is I love politics, but I'm depressed.
Will it change with the manifesto? Is the manifesto signed off?
No, not yet. So that's why I said it's in the mix. But the final edit is yet to come, and let's see where the cuts fall, so to speak. But what I would say is, what I'm going to do in this election is take the opportunity to go and meet people I've never met, talk to them about what they care about, and build for after the election, because the story's going to go on, Tim. It's not going to be resolved. This is just a minor episode in a very long story. That's how it will be, and it won't necessarily be a resolution. This could be just a continuation. And for those, I just want to reiterate this, for those whose overriding commitment is is to the lives of the poor. Nothing was more important than to go and talk to poor people as an equal, with a reciprocal heart, to be prepared to learn from them, to challenge our dogmas, and to
Listen for at least 45 seconds.
At least 45 seconds without correcting them. And because the big transformation of my life was when I worked was an organiser, was when I accepted the leadership of the poor. That was the big turning point for me, when the cleaners and the cooks took the lead. It was really liberating, and I learned all these things that I'd gone to university to forget: the importance of family, the importance of honour and honesty. These were the things that suddenly, oh my God, my mum was right. Oh no, and it did take 3 or 4 years of massive mayhem to actually be able to articulate that. But that's the point.
Ladies and gentlemen, Maurice Glasman.